So when you're solving a law of signs proportion, okay, the first situation we're going to look at is when one of the sides is unknown. Okay, so you don't have a variable in your sign part, it's just an unknown side. Okay, there's more than one way that you can do this. The most precise way is to keep the sign of 40 and the sign of 32 as is until you get x by itself. Okay, but if that's too much to deal with at the end, you could turn these into decimals. Okay, so I'm going to kind of show you two ways. All right. The first way is we'll just turn them into decimals. All right, so using your calculator, we're going to do sine of 40, which is 0.642787. I would use maybe 3 to 4 decimals to avoid too much of a rounding error. Okay, so we'll use 0.6428. Over 20, and then we're going to do sine of 32. So 4 decimals on that would be 0.5299 over x. And you've done these before, maybe not with the decimals, but it's just cross multiplying. So the more of this you can leave in your calculator, the better. We usually end up multiplying these two and multiplying those two, right? And to get x by itself, we would divide that out, yeah? So 0.5299 times 20 equals 10.5984, and this would be 0.6428x. We're going to divide out the 0.6428. So x equals 16.4878. We'll round to the nearest. We'll round to 3 places on these, because that's what upper level wants us to do if it doesn't specify. So 3 decimal places, so it'd be 4878, which would round that to 8. Okay, so 16.488. The other way, if your calculator will allow you, it's better to leave this stuff, you know, unrounded as long as possible. So if I cross multiply these as is, I would have x times the sine of 40 equals 20 times the sine of 32. Notice I'm putting the side, or the whole number, so to speak, first, so you don't mistakenly do the sine of 32 times 20. In order to get x by itself, I'd need to divide out the sine of 40, right? So we're going to divide the sine of 40 on each side. So x is 20 times the sine of 32 divided by the sine of 40. If you have a calculator that will allow you to put in a string of things, it's going, because there's no addition or subtraction in here, it would evaluate it correctly for you to do 20 sine of 32 divided by sine of 40. Otherwise, with the classroom calculators, you would do 32, take the sine, multiply by 20, probably need to write that decimal down, and then get a decimal for the sine of 40, and then do the division. Okay, but if your calculator will allow you, 20 sine of 32 divided by sine of 40 gives me 16.4881, so it's coming out with what we have here. Okay, so I would say, to be on the safe side, if you're going to turn these into decimals, keep it at 4 decimal places, rounding appropriately, and you should come up with the correct rounding at the end as well. Yep. With this, Okay. Do you have, what kind of calculator do you have? TI 30? Yeah. Okay, do 20 sine of 32, enter. Now divide, leave that answer in, divide by the sine of 40. Okay, 488, yeah. So maybe just enter in between the division. I don't know why it would figure it any differently, but so do the top first, enter, and then divide by the sign, of your number. Okay, so either way is fine. If your calculator will allow you, this is less writing down of decimals. Okay, but if not, you're just going to have to write some decimals down and then do your cross multiplying. Okay. All right, the other situation with sine, the other algebra situation, is the first one that we had, the sine of 112 over 25 equals the sine of x over 12. And in this situation, your variable is attached to sine. And if you're having flashbacks to the trig section that we did, you know that you can't undo these without the inverse function, right? Sine of x is a number. Sine by itself is a word.
Sorry to interrupt. You have those quizzes for 130.
Yes.
It's like what I do. I set them down and then.
Forget what you.
Right. If I can stop that later too. I'm not prep right now.
I had a mistake.
I can come back in a little bit.
Okay. I'll check in a second.
All
I've
right.
got them floating around somewhere. Okay. So you can't separate these without inverse sine. So just consider that a number until the very end. You're not going to deal with getting rid of the sign on the x until the last step. Okay. So two ways. You can turn that into a decimal if you want. Write down up to four places. I'm not going to do that at this point. I'm going to do it leaving the sign as the sign. But when we cross multiply, we have 12 times the sine of 112 equals 25 times the sine of x. To start to get x by itself, remember you can't divide out a word. Doesn't mean anything. These are a package deal, so maybe, put a box around it or something so you don't try and separate them right now. We need to get rid of 25. So here, I'm going to rewrite this so you can see the total step. So you're going to divide out 25. So we have the sine of x equals 12 times the sine of 112 over 25. Okay. At this point, our goal is to get this down to a decimal or a number, just one number. Okay. So if you turned that into a decimal, some calculators you might have to do 112, take the sine, that's your sine of 112, times 12, then divide by 25. So take a second, pop this into your calculator, and see what decimal you end up with. So what are you coming up with for a decimal? Yep, 0.4450, right? So 0.445 is really all you need, equals the sine of x. And to separate sine from x is where we use the inverse sine. Technically, you're doing it to both sides because that's the only thing that will cancel this out. So you're going to take the inverse sine, which cancels that out, leaving us with x. But in your calculator, if that decimal is still there and you can do the inverse sine while it's still in your calculator, that's the best case scenario. So do the second inverse sine, and I'm getting 26.426. Is that what you guys are coming up with? Okay. If you just use 0.445, that's a little bit of a rounding difference. The biggest thing, since this is an angle, I would say probably no more than a tenth as far as rounding. So if you would round to 26.4, then you're good. Okay, so 26.4 degrees, we'll do a tenth on the angle at this point. Okay. If I got to this point, would it make sense to you to have an angle that was 0.44 degrees? Probably not. So that should be your clue. You're solving for an angle, and this would not make sense. So you've got to take it that step further and do the inverse sine. Okay.